About 10 years ago now, George Barna, who is Christianity's, or at least American Christianity's, greatest statistical researcher, did a study of unchurched or non-Christian people. And he wanted to find out why they weren't Christians, what their biggest hurdles to the Christian faith were. And the top three were all very close, statistically speaking. Somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of every single American adult polled who was unchurched gave one of these top three responses. And one of the top three responses was very simply, they have no idea what we're saying. They don't understand what we're saying. And most churched people don't get that. Because the more you come to a place like this, Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, summer, spring, and fall, you get used to the language that we use. You get used to the ideas that we throw around. You get used to the things we do. And you lose the perspective of an outsider who, when they walk into this thing for the first time, have no idea what we're doing or what we're saying. We even use words in here to each other that you don't use in your normal everyday life. Think of all the terms, just the vocabulary that we throw around in church that you would never think to use in a conversation at home or in your workplace. Yet that's why outsiders don't understand what it is that we're saying. The Christian message, which those of us who are Christians find to be life-changing and redemptive, for those people on the outside has been lost. Completely lost because they simply don't understand what we're trying to communicate. This, by the way, is similar to something you may not know about your Bible. Big pieces of your Bible were written by Jewish people for Jewish people. And guess what? I don't see a lot of yarmulkes and phylacteries and gesundheits around here this morning. Most of us are not Jewish people. And so even those of us on the inside of the Christian faith, sometimes when we open the Bible, we read it and go, I'm not sure what that says. I'm not sure what that means. And that's why actually it's very important to pay attention to the places in your Bible, and this is mostly in the New Testament, the times of Jesus and after, when Christianity begins to spread to people like you and I, who don't have a background in the Jewish faith, who have no clue about that kind of stuff. And Christians had to figure out a way to explain Christianity to people who had no clue about it. That's what we're going to focus on for the next 4 weeks together. In this series, I want you to know that I am trying to address everybody, of course, but distinctly two groups of people. Number one, I am trying to address people who may be like those American adults who have no idea what it is we're trying to say. And I want to take the text that we look at in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 17, and I want to use it to help you understand what Christianity is all about. And here's the bonus. You may have been a Christian for 30 years or 40 years, and I'm going to guarantee you now that you are going to hear things in this text we look at that are going to be refreshing to you and eye-opening to you, and it's going to really change or maybe renew the way you understand what Christianity is all about. So that's one group. And the other group is for everybody in the room who considers themselves a Christian, and at some point has tried to explain to a friend or an acquaintance or a neighbor what this Christian thing is all about, and maybe has felt at a loss for words. well, then this series and this text we're going to look at is for you. Because that is exactly the position that the old Apostle Paul, founder of most of the churches in that first generation of Christians, that's the situation he found himself in. And we are going to learn from him how to explain our faith to people who have no understanding of what it is or even of the Bible itself. To do that, I need to tell you the story of Acts chapter 17, verses 16 to 31. This occurs in Paul's second missionary journey. That is an old picture of Paul. He apparently had a receding hairline because his forehead is exceptionally big. This is the guy who is responsible for the writing of most of your New Testament, most of the stuff after Jesus. This guy wrote it. Like I said, he planted most of the churches of the first generation of Christians. Big deal. He's on his second journey planting churches around the Eastern Roman Empire, and he comes to Athens. Big deal city. Athens, home to philosophers and politicians who have shaped Western culture then and now. One of the most important intellectual cities in the history of mankind. And Paul comes to Athens. And he notices while he's there in Athens, all of these idols to all of these gods. And if you remember studying in 5th grade Greek mythology, there's all kinds of gods. I couldn't find any good images of Greek ancient idols on Googling images this week, so that actually happens to be the golden idol from the first Indiana Jones. What are you going to do? And it says in Acts chapter 17 that when Paul is observing in this very astute, educated, intellectual city, all of these idols of worship, all of these caricatures of God around, it says, I quote, he was deeply distressed. And this is a word in ancient Greek that you can almost not translate into English because it is a word of such intensity and depth. He was grieved. His heart broke. His soul wept. Those would be English equivalents. He hurt for these people, despite how erudite and smart they were. And so he begins to talk to them about the Christian faith and what Christianity is and what it is we believe. And if you read the opening verses to this paragraph in Acts chapter 17, here is what the Greeks conclude. You're a babbler. That's the word in ancient Greek. You're a babbler. You're like a baby making noises that we don't understand. The religion that you're talking to us about is weird. And specifically, they latched on to two things about the Christian faith that seemed abundantly weird to them. A, Jesus, and B, the resurrection from the dead. And so these Greeks wanted to give Paul a good listen about this spirituality that they'd never encountered before called Christianity. And so they asked him to come to a place called the Areopagus. It looks like that. And it's a place where they would gather together and they would learn together and they would dialogue together and they would discuss together. And they give Paul the privilege of coming and taking center court at this place to present this heretofore in Athens never heard faith called Christianity. Can you imagine how intimidating that would be? To stand up, I don't care how high your IQ is as a Christian, stand up in the center of a city that was home to Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, and all those other people who have shaped the known world. And Paul is asked to present Christianity to these people who are exceedingly bright and who have no clue about the Bible, Jesus, or any of it. And that's where we're going to pick it up. And for the next 4 weeks, we are going to look at how Paul explains Christianity to these people. This is where he starts. He stands up in the Areopagus and he says, "Men of Athens, I see or perceive that in every way you are very religious people. For as I have passed along, I have observed the objects of your worship. I found also an altar or an idol with this inscription: this idol is to an unknown God. Therefore, what you worship as unknown, I proclaim to you as known." So he starts by noting for them what greatly distressed him before, that they had all these idols to all these gods in the Greek pantheon, and he starts his presentation of Christianity there. He mentions a specific altar or idol called the altar to the unknown God. We're not sure, we think this goes back 600 years prior to the time of this speech, to a guy named Epimenides, who during the time of war and great famine in Athens threw his hands up in the air and said, well, obviously the gods that we know about don't care about what's going on. So we're going to build an idol to a god that maybe is there and we don't know about, and we will offer sacrifices to it, etc., to see if maybe that unknown God will give a care, stop the famine, and stop the wars. It was actually very common in towns even other than Athens in the Roman Empire to have a statue like that. There's an air of spiritual humility about it. We think the gods are A, B, C, D, X, Y, and Z, but we could be wrong. Our sight is limited. So we're going to cover all our bases and have an altar to the God that we don't know and who might get mad if we don't show him the proper reverence and respect. What do you see here in where Paul starts his presentation of Christianity to this brilliant and yet uninformed group of people? Well, he starts by affirming something. He starts by looking into their way of life and how they live and what they believe and finding something to affirm. He found, in his case, walking around Athens, all of these idols to all of these gods that he did not personally believe in. And he starts his speech by saying to these people, I see with my little eye that you are really religious people. Because I've walked around and seen all of your places and objects of worship. And I applaud you for that. I affirm that. And you're especially smart because you have this one particular altar or site of worship to an unknown God. That's pretty bright on your part too. Now remember I said this is a series for two groups of people. Let me start by addressing Christian people in the room who on occasion feel like or have opportunity to explain their faith to non-Christian people. Depending on where you were raised or in what part of Christianity you grew up, you were not taught to do this. In fact, you were taught to do the exact opposite, which is every time you talk to a non-Christian person or every time you observe the largely non-Christian culture around you in our country, you're taught to disagree with it first. You're taught to find all the things you don't like or you can't affirm, right? You've heard sermon after sermon after sermon, hopefully not by me, railing against things in our culture that Christians shouldn't like or agree with, and sometimes rightly so. This is not where Paul starts. Do you really like it when you meet somebody for the first time and the first words out of their mouth are, hey, let me tell you why you're wrong? Oh, dude, You have blown it so big. Let me tell you how you're wrong. Admit with me that at that moment your ears turn off. Yes? Okay. Christian person, let's stop doing this to people about the Christian faith. Because in Paul's opinion, there is plenty to find in the lives of people around us and even the culture around us that, yes, we can gasp, affirm, and start from a place that's positive. A foundation upon which we can build, which is what he's going to do over the rest of this speech and the 4 weeks it will take for us to cover it. He starts from a place of affirmation and positivity. Think we could do that too? This is great, by the way, for those of you in the room who aren't familiar with Christianity and for whom I'm trying to communicate the Christian faith in a way that you will understand. Here, according to the great St. Paul, who is a far better representation of Christianity and exponent of it than I will ever be, here's the first thing he wants you to know. There are things in your life that you believe. There are even spiritual impulses or instincts that you have in your life right now as a non-Christian person that are right. And I, as a Christian, want to help you pay attention to those, to see those. Because then we can have a dialogue about what Christianity is and how it builds on what's already there. You see how different this is? That's what Paul's doing in the opening of his speech in Acts 17. Wow. Amazing, right? So, take a minute for me. And this, by the way, I hope you have fun doing the rest of the week. I want you to live your life from now till next Sunday with very open eyes. Because I want you to play like you're St. Paul in your little Athens here. And I want you to see if you can find in the lives of your friends or in what you see in the culture around you, things that you can affirm, where you see the fingerprints of God or his movement already, so that then maybe you could advance the conversation further from there. Instead of nitpicking it, find the things that you can affirm. Some examples. Romans chapter 2 tells us, also written by this guy Paul, that one of the remarkable things about human beings is, even if they have never read the Bible a day in their life, you know what's true about them? He says it's written on their hearts. Which means that every human being has a moral conscience. And this could be somebody who doesn't even believe in God at all. They have a moral conscience. That means every American you encounter today, this week, has a moral conscience. They have that deep sense of right and wrong, of justice, of fairness, of love prevailing over evil. And you, as a wise Christian person, need to help your friends who aren't churched or aren't Christian listen to that voice and find it. Because it is the evidence of God's activity in their life already. It is a positive thing that you can affirm. It's a starting place for their relationship with God that they may someday have. A moral conscience. This is one of the places where you and I find in our day and time an altar to an unknown God. A positive place we can start a conversation. How about this one? If you pay attention to television shows, pop music, typical movies that make a lot of money in movie theaters. I have a teenage daughter at home now. I hear pop music coming out of the bathroom when she's showering all the time. Here's one of the prevailing themes that you will hear. Love is great. Love is grand. Find the right guy, and you know what? It's going to be like fireworks going off overhead all the time. You're going to feel like your heart is going to burst. He's going to give you flowers every day. chocolates every day. He is going to make your world right. And I listen to that as a jaded, almost 45-year-old and go, yeah, okay, no, Shiloh, let me instruct you in the ways of the world and how unwise that is. But see, if I really had my St. Paul ears on, I would listen to this the way that he observed the culture of ancient Athens. And I would hear that in our particular culture, at our particular time, number one, there's an extraordinary value placed on romantic love. And you know what? The Bible agrees with that, especially marriage. Marriage, according to the Bible, is an extraordinary thing. It's a unique thing. Paul himself says about marriage, it is a place you can look in the world and find a physical example of how Christ loves the church. I can affirm that for any 20-something I talk to who is buying into that same flawed mythology. But I can also say to them, wow, you really think that if you find the right person, the needle in the haystack, that all of a sudden your life's going to be grand and great and all your dreams are going to come true? Don't you feel like that's putting a little too much pressure on that person? Because it never turns out really well when you make another human being your God. And that could be your date or your spouse or your kids or your parents. Never turns out well. And all of a sudden, I've taken this thing in our culture that I've observed, and we have shaped it into a really positive, affirming, insightful spiritual conversation. You see that? It's all over the place. It is all around us. You have friends tomorrow you're going to encounter in the workplace who tell you very sincerely, if they were honest with you, you know what, I am looking for God as hard as I can. I want God in my life, and I cannot find him. And your words to them are not, oh, you just need to have better faith. Sorry, they're going to stop listening to you. You know what your words to them need to be? Hey, there are parts of the Bible that feel the exact same way. Most of the Psalms in the Old Testament are about that very struggle. Someone who wants desperately to believe that God is active and good in their life, and they can't find him right now. And so they cry out. And you can say to them, you know what? That experience you're having doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. It doesn't mean that God is mad at you. It doesn't mean that you have somehow missed the boat. Actually, what you're experiencing is something that the most faithful Christian people in history have experienced at some point. Oh, wow. Can you imagine the doors that would open for you if you just had that conversation? You see it? Paul starts from a place of affirmation. He takes his time, he looks around him, and he finds the things he can build on. He finds the doors he can open, and he affirms it. This, Christian people, is what we need to do. It doesn't stop there. In the opening 2 verses of this speech, he starts with this resounding affirmation of what he sees in their culture that he himself may not even agree with. And then he moves on to say, hey, see that altar to an unknown God that you have put up because you're afraid that that unknown God may get mad at you if you didn't? Here's what I want you to know about Christianity, he says to them. What you think is unknown, I am going to make known to you. That God that you're afraid you don't see or perceive, I think Christianity makes known to you. This is where he starts. He affirms again to them that, you know what? It can be exceedingly frustrating as a sincere, earnest, religious, spiritual-minded person. It can be very frustrating sometimes because it feels like chasing after God is like chasing after a ghost. And so you end up in your own mind, in your own heart, eventually at some point erecting your own little altar to an unknown God. You've tried, you can't find him, and you just say, God, here's my little altar to you. I hope you're happy with me. I got to go on about my business because I have not been able to track you down. We can do that for people. We act like sometime this whole God thing, this whole having a relationship with God thing, this is child's play. And if you really were trying, if you really did care, then it would all kind of work out, or you'd find him. Yeah, take this or leave it. I kind of think the people who think that way are people who haven't tried real hard to have a relationship with God. And that goes for very devout, sincere Christian people. Because the more you really try to live every day and every week his way, or in closeness with him, trying to find a sense of his presence every day, the more you find sometimes, not all the time, sometimes it's elusive. And it can be frustrating. Imagine how liberating it would be for your non-Christian friends if you as a Christian said, you know what, I've been doing this 40 years and sometimes I feel that way too. Yeah. And Paul says his first outlandish claim, and he makes it in the first 2 verses of this speech to this smart, uninformed crowd. He says, that spiritual ambiguity that you have, let me tell you what Christianity does. It turns the light on in the room. You've had that experience, right? You've lived in your house 10 years, you think you know everything about it. You wake up at 2 in the morning, it's a new moon, it's very dark outside, you need to turn the light on in the room. And you are fumbling around, tripping over the dirty clothes that your wife left on the floor. Not that my wife ever leaves dirty clothes on the floor. Tripping over the DVD player that my kids left in the room on the floor. Not that my kids have ever left a DVD player in the room on the floor. And you're fumbling around trying to find the light switch on the wall. That right there is a description of how many of us feel about trying to find God. And here's the outlandish thing that Paul is saying. You find the light switch and you turn it on. And all of a sudden, all those things that were dark and shadowy and obscure become clear. This is what he claims to them about Christianity. You can also appreciate why it is that when I told you the story that led up to him making this speech, they concluded that his claims about making God, who is vague and hard to find, crystal clear and known, sounded a little weird and audacious, bold and brash to make that claim. And specifically, you might remember, I said that in the text we are told that the people of Athens thought that 2 things were especially weird about this Christian faith that Paul was going to present to them. Number 1, Jesus, and number 2, the resurrection. Here's the thing, Christian person, and I think it's important for you who are unchurched to understand this too. If what we're saying to you doesn't sound strange on occasion, then we're not saying it right. If what we're saying to you makes perfect sense to you and seems to fit with everything else that you've ever heard from other people around you, then we're not explaining it right. Because apparently there are things about the Christian faith that are unique enough or distinct enough that when we say them to smart people like the Athenians, it sounds strange. Like Jesus, for instance. What do Christians claim about Jesus? Oh, just that he was fully God and fully man. That's all. Both at the same time. That sounds kind of strange. When you hear it for the first time, at the very least, right? That was their reaction too. And of course, my reply to that is, well, what are your other choices? Most American people, if you look at the Gallup and Barna polls, have a great deal of respect for Jesus. Why? If you have a great deal of respect for Jesus, it seems like Christians have just taken that to its logical length, which is to say that the reason we respect him so much is that we believe he is the representation and voice of God in human flesh. But it does sound strange for someone to say that to you. Sure. And the resurrection from the dead is no different. You've never seen a dead person raised from the dead. Every funeral you've gone to has not ended up that way. Right? Of course the Athenians would listen and go, yeah, that's weird. They believed in an afterlife. They did not believe it was physical resurrection from the dead. Strange, this message that you and I claim. And yet somehow, we as Christian people say, in this strange, unique message that is Christianity, we make God known. We make God known. That, of course, is the best reply about Jesus that I know. Of course, it's natural for someone who is unfamiliar with Christianity to say, when they hear us claim that Jesus was fully human and fully God, that makes no sense to me. Sure, I get that. But let's talk about who God is then. And they may say things like God is everywhere, and God is eternal, and God is strong, and God is wise, and God controls everything, and whether or not those words are right, here's my reply as a Christian person. You know what God's like? He's like Jesus. Because that's what the distinct, unique, weird Christian message says. God is like Jesus. And you should not believe in any God or anything about God that doesn't look like Jesus in your Bible. And then you take that person who's never heard Christianity before, who thinks the message of Jesus being man and God, and all of a sudden you can almost see a light bulb go on, and they're like, that's pretty cool, because I like Jesus. And I'll bet I would like a God who was like Jesus. Paul says, Christianity makes God known. And that claim is strange. You need to prepare yourself for that. But Christianity makes God known. What you will hear, you've heard it this week, and what you will hear every week of this series as we talk about this message that Paul preached to people who were completely unfamiliar with Christianity, is that there is one deep underlying assumption that Paul has, that he is building on, and really that he's presenting throughout this entire message. And it is very simply this: God is everywhere. God is not confined to a certain place or a certain time or a certain people. God is at work everywhere. We just have to pay attention. Paul shows up in a city that had never before heard the Christian message. There were no Christians in Athens yet, at all. And his assumption is, if I pay attention, I can already find in the lives of these people the way that God is beginning to show up, the way that they are stretching out and trying to find him. All I have to do is look, because God is already here and already active. This is just as true for the people around you. Every person around you, O Christian, who is not churched, who doesn't believe in God at all, who's been burned by church in the past, your coworkers that you will see tomorrow, here's something I know for certain today. God is already at work in their life. He is already active in their life. He's already there. He preceded you there. He is already trying to love them and care for them. The only question is, are they listening? Are they paying attention? That, by the way, was the moment of your conversion to the Christian faith. And mine. It is not the moment when God decided he would start loving you. It's the moment when you and I decided we'd start listening. because he always has loved us. He does today, and he always will. We're just the ones who have decided we'll pay attention. You see it? God is everywhere and already active. We need to approach every person and every conversation that way. If you are not a Christian person and you are hearing this, you should take heart at this too. You know why? Because God is already active in your life. You just need to pay attention. You are already trying to figure out who he is and what makes sense in life and what's really meaningful and why you're moral the way you are. Great. That is the presence of God already in your life. Open your eyes and pay attention. And we as Christians would say, let us help you take what is unknown in your life and make it known. This is your journey into becoming a quote-unquote Christian, according to Paul. Here's how the great Saint John Chrysostom, 1700 years ago, Archbishop of Constantinople, said it. He said, quote, God is everywhere. It is your decision how close to him you will live. God is everywhere already. It is your decision today, no matter who you are, how close to him you will live. Let's take a minute here at the end of the message. Let me give you a moment to chew on and reflect on these great but maybe new ideas that you've never heard before from the pen of Luke recording the words of St. Paul. Up on the screen are maybe a few things that you and God could talk about for a few minutes in the quiet, but don't be confined by what's on the screen. Take a minute. Allow God to use what I've presented to instruct and inform you. And then after a moment or two, I will pray out loud for us all.